I'm glad you could be here this morning. If you've got a Bible there with you, I want you to turn with me to the book of Esther. We're going to be in Esther chapter 7 this morning. And I want to just catch you up a little bit because if you're visiting this morning, the passage that we're reading won't make sense unless you remember, if you know the context. And so I want to remind us of everything that's been happening up to this point in time. Then we'll stand and we'll read it together and think about what God would have to say to us this morning. But remember the context. 485 BC is the beginning of the book of Esther. It's the Persian Empire. The Jews have been carried off into exile back in about 586 BC. The main character, Esther, her family was taken into exile back in 586, brought into the Persian Empire, the city of Susa, right, which is the capital where King Xerxes is now on the throne. Chapter 1 starts off, and if you remember, there's the 180-day party. At the partway through the party, the king decides the whole goal of the party is to kind of parade his wealth before everybody, all of his friends that he's invited to this party so they can see how great he is. At one point, he decides he's going to bring his wife, Queen Vashti, in and parade her in front of everyone. So he sends notice to the queen who's partying with all the ladies in another place and says, "Come, I want to parade you." She says no. He gets angry. She gets kicked out of the kingdom. And then the king basically decides he's going to have a competition to pick his next wife. And so his officials go around, they pick all the most beautiful women in the empire, which is a massive empire at this point in time. It's massive. And in the midst of those who are chosen, there's one woman whose name is Esther, which means star, who is a young Jewish girl with a bit of a tragic story. She loses her parents when she's young. She gets adopted by her cousin, whose name is Mordecai, who serves in the palace in Susa. But she gets chosen, and in the process, she begins to find favor, and she ends up being, among all the women in all the empire, she gets chosen by the king, and she becomes queen. And then the story begins to unfold because there's a man by the name of Haman who gets promoted in the empire above everybody else, and the promotion from Xerxes is that everyone is to bow down to Haman. And so whenever Haman is coming through, people are supposed to bow down, but Mordecai, the adopted father and the cousin of Esther, refuses. And the reason he refuses is because he's a Jew. Haman finds out and puts a plan together, not to just get Mordecai, but to basically, he wants to annihilate all the Jews. We're going to kill them all. And so he goes to Xerxes, and he's deceptive. He doesn't tell, and by the way, this is really important, Esther never once reveals that she's a Jew in the process of becoming queen. No one knows that she's a Jew, except for her adopted father, her cousin Mordecai. So Haman comes up with this plan. He's deceptive because he goes to the king and says, there's a people in your empire who they don't really fit in. They don't follow our laws. Their customs don't align with ours, and so we should annihilate. We should kill them all. And Xerxes says, okay, let's go ahead and do that. You write the law. I don't want to know any of the details. And so again, Xerxes has no idea that it's the Jews. He has no idea that this is going to affect his new queen, his new wife. Haman goes, writes the law into place. The Jews are going to be killed. And the law is sent out throughout the land. Everybody finds out, except Esther has no idea that this is happening. Mordecai finds out, and he comes in mourning to the gate of the palace. Esther finds out, and they have a little bit of a back and forth, and Mordecai ultimately tells her, hey, look, this is what's happening. The king there's been a law that's been put in place. All the Jews are going to be annihilated. You need to go, and you need to talk to the king. And Esther's response back is, wait a minute, you want me to do what? Do you understand the risk and the danger? Because if you go into the presence of the king without being invited, unless the king extends his scepter to you, you'll be killed. And Mordecai's response, and we'll look at it again later on this morning because it's the very heart of this whole book. His whole response is basically, God has put you here for this time, for this reason. You're where you are so that you can speak on behalf of the people of Israel. And she goes to prayer, and after they pray, they come out, and she's got a plan. And she goes to the king. The king extends his scepter. She says, what do you want? And she says, well, I'd like to have dinner with you and Haman. And so they have a meal, and at the end of the meal, the king says again, okay, so what do you want, Esther? We're eating together. What is the deal? And she says, here's what I'd like. I'd like another dinner. And so that's what's happening at the beginning of chapter 7 is they're sitting down for their second dinner. Would you stand with me as we read God's word together this morning? So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther, the second meal. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Even half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request." In other words, save me and save my people. "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss of the king." Then King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes, said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? Who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman, Jafar." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And again, Haman has had no idea. Think about the shock here. He's after Mordecai. He's going to kill the Jews. The plan has been put in place. And suddenly, everything is coming crashing down on Haman. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking, went to the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. He's not falling on Esther. He's falling at her feet to beg for his life, but again, it all gets twisted. It's not working out well for him, right? And the king returned, and the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house?" As the word, and it's the word of judgment, and he's basically saying, execute him. As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high." Remember, Scott talked about this last Sunday if you weren't here. At the end of chapter 2, Haman intercedes for Xerxes because he finds out about a plot to assassinate the king. He sends word, he saves his life. Mordecai saves the king's life. Haman's plotting his death, and his wife tells him, "We'll build a gallows. We're going to hang him in our own property." He's built this gallows to hang him, and so the eunuch says, "Hey, he's actually built a gallows." And so the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king was abated. And read a little bit further with me. We're going to go into chapter 8 for a few moments. Verse 5. Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." Verse 10, skip to verse 10. And he wrote, this is Mordecai, and Mordecai wrote in the name of the king and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children, women included, and to plunder their goods. And then skip down to verse 15. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. This is God's word. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you for your word. And God, I pray as we reflect on it this morning, Lord, that as you speak to us through it, because you are always speaking to us through your word is living and active. I pray that it would pierce through our clouded thinking. I pray that it would pierce through our distractions. I pray that it would pierce all the way to our hearts, that, Lord, it might graciously reveal areas in us that need to be addressed and changed. And that piercing of our hearts would also, God, it would be filled with grace. That we would stand in light of your word and your light of your truth, that we might see more clearly and we might live in the very freedom that you have given to us. There are things here that I know you want to say specifically to each and every one of us. And so, God, I thank you that it's not my words, but by your Spirit that you would do that, that you do that. And I pray, Lord, that we would not harden ourselves or pass over these things quickly. I pray that even as we're maybe a little bit tired, a little bit weary from losing an hour of sleep last night, that, God, you might wake us up, that you might make us attentive to what you would have to say. I pray it in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. You may be seated. So 2 weeks ago, I told you about a friend of mine who had just gone into hospice. I'd gone to see him on Saturday night 2 weeks ago, and I sat with him. I hadn't seen him for a while because he'd been diagnosed with cancer about 2.5 years before that, and everything seemed to be going well. And then all of a sudden, everything changed literally in a moment. It was so fast. And so I went to see him, and he goes to the Naperville campus. Sarah and I and our kids, we've been on vacation. We'd spent time with them. We'd been out boating with them. We'd done a number of things with them, and went and visited with him, and he was at a point where he wasn't even able to eat, and we're sitting there in the room, and he looks at me and he says, this isn't the end, this isn't it. I still want to have you and Sarah and the kids over for dinner. We're going to spend some more time together. I'm sitting there as he's saying this thinking, I don't even know how to respond in this moment. And last Sunday, we attended his funeral service. And this might surprise you. In fact, I imagine it would. There are times in those moments where I just don't know what to say. You might think I always have something to say. I can always say something. There are times where I don't even know how to, I don't know what to say. And I think we all want to have the right thing in that moment to say, to encourage. And sometimes the thing to say is nothing at all. Sometimes it's just being there and spending time with somebody who's hurting. I mean, this is a young dad who's got twins, teenage boys, and his wife now that he's left behind. And we want to have the right thing to be able to say, to be able to encourage and comfort them. Sometimes the best thing to say is nothing and just to be there with them, and to pray with them. But there's one particular verse that comes to my mind. I mean, you think about when you know someone is struggling and somebody's suffering, they're going through a difficult time, what do you say to them? What do you say to encourage someone who is going through a trial? Whatever it is, the loss, sure, it could be the loss of a loved one, maybe it's just a sickness, maybe it's some trouble at work, maybe there's I was with somebody, I think yesterday, if I remember correctly, I can't keep track of my days right now, somebody who was telling me about an issue that they're having at work. And their boss has these expectations that they can never meet, always using foul language. It's just this constant tension that's going on in their lives. Maybe it's a situation at work. Maybe it's a struggle in someone's marriage. Maybe it's difficulty with raising kids. Whatever it is, what do you say to people when they're going through difficult times? What do you say? There's one verse in particular that tends to come to my mind when I think of people going through challenging situations. And it's one of those verses you have to be very careful with because you can say it and it just comes across as flippant. It can become almost this platitude that makes it sound like it's the Christian version of suck it up. Just get over it. It's a verse that I know that I need to hear when I'm wrestling. In fact, there's times when Sarah will remind me of this verse, and depending on where I am at that moment, there's times I want to respond with not such a nice response because it's just, there's times when you're in the middle of it and it just doesn't, it's almost downplays. She isn't downplaying it, but it feels like it downplays the difficulty of a situation. But it's not a platitude and it's not a downplaying of our circumstances. It is a truth that though it's easy to apply to others when they're going through it, it's a truth that needs to apply to you and to me when we're going through it. And it's a truth that when it goes from something that's just up here to here, when it goes from something that we can say, sure, that's a truth out there, to it's a truth that we actually live by that defines us, it has the power to literally change everything, to take the darkest moments in your life and to put it into full-blown light, to bring color and hope and joy in the most difficult of circumstances. And I want to read it to you right now. And some of you desperately need to hear this verse right now, not as a downplay of the difficulty of your circumstances, but as a truth in the midst of them. And so whatever you need to do right now, if you need to just close your eyes and reflect, I'm going to read it in a couple different versions. And my hope is that we'll just let it sink in for a few minutes. Because this verse is what is happening throughout the whole book of Esther. And we have to get beyond just talking about what's happening in Esther and beyond just the truth of this to asking this: do we really believe it? Do we really believe this? Is it more than a truth that we can assent to and a reality that's actually defining the way that we live? It's one thing to be able to quote it, it's another thing to be able to apply it. And so I'm going to read it. And whatever you need to do, I want you to just let it sink in for a few moments. We are confident that God is able to orchestrate everything to work towards something good and beautiful. We can be so sure, here's another version, we can be so sure that every detail in our lives of love for God is worked into something good. We know that God makes all things work together for the good of those who love Him and are chosen to be a part of His plan. And we know that those who love God, for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to His purposes. Now, here's the version that I grew up with. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Let it sink in for just a second. For we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. A couple of different translations, but there's one very, very important theme. God is working all things, not some things, not just the good things, not most things. He's working every single thing. That means the good moments, the hard moments, the easy moments, the challenging situations, the trials, the blessings, every single thing, even evil, God is overruling, and He's working every single piece of it together for your good. It's the same message over and over, but here's the thing. Paul doesn't say we think. Paul doesn't say we hope. Paul doesn't say maybe. He says we know. And here's the question I want to ask to you today. Do you know? Do you know? And it's not, the knowing here is not an intellectual knowing. I'm not asking, can you agree to it in an intellectual way? I'm not asking, can you go, oh yeah, I know that verse. I remember that. What I'm asking is, do you know it? Are you confident in it? Do you believe it? Does it define your life? And here's the real test. Here's the real challenge. Not when things are going well, not when you're sitting in a seat in the sanctuary, but when things seem to be falling apart, when your life is going through the toilet, when nothing is looking up, when you have no idea where things are going, when everything seems uncertain, do you know? Paul says, here's what we do. We know that everything, in all things, God is working for good for those who love Him, who've been called according to His will. In every single circumstance, in every single situation, God is working for good. That is what we're seeing play out in the whole book of Esther. That's the story. Yes, all of this is happening. Yes, there's a plan to annihilate the Jews. And yes, it seems like everything is hopeless. I mean, there's a law that's been put in place. The king even says that once a law is put in place, it can't be undone. The law that was written to annihilate the Jews it's sealed. It's done. You can't undo it. You can't go to the king and say, hey, unwrite that law, because once it's written, it's solid, it's firm, and even the king himself can't undo the law. It's a seeming hopeless situation, yet here's what's amazing. The story of Esther is a story of, even though God is never mentioned explicitly once, it is a story in which God is on every single page, because before Haman is promoted, before Mordecai refuses to bow, before a law is written to annihilate the Jews, before all of that, God is working in the life of a young woman by the name of Esther so that she might become queen, so that she might be in the right place at the right time to speak on behalf of God's people. And here's what we're seeing this morning, is that the enemy is defeated, God's people are saved, and it's not because of the plans and the scheming of men, it's because of the providence of God. And that's what Romans 8, verse 28 is. It's the providence of God. And I know that's not a word that we use very often. We don't really talk about providence very much. But it's an extremely important truth. That again, when we see it, when we know it, not when it's just up here, but when we know it, it has the power to change everything. And here's providence. J. Vernon McGee, who was a pastor, teacher, and a theologian from the 20th century, says this. He says, what is providence? Here's a theological definition. Providence is the means by which God directs all things, both animate and inanimate, seen and unseen, good and evil, toward a worthy purpose, which means his will must finally prevail. Or as the psalmist said, his kingdom ruleth over all. In Ephesians 1:11, Paul tells us that God worketh all things after the counsel of his own will. Our God is running the universe today, friends, and even though there are some who think that it has slipped out from under him. Or as he puts it later on, he says, God's providence means that the hand of God is in the glove of human events. Here's my definition. God's providence is God's personal, intentional, often unseen involvement in the affairs of this world, including your life, in which he is working all things together, even overruling evil for the good of his people. It is God's personal, intentional, often unseen involvement in the affairs of life in which he is working all things together, even overruling evil for the good of his people. Or as Scott Chivers said it last week, our God is the God of coincidences. In other words, there are no coincidences. There's only providence. Those things that seem chance, those things that seem like, well, it just happened that way. It didn't just happen that way. That God is personally and intimately engaged in life. Paul says, we know that God works all things together for the good of his people. We know it. And yet what's interesting about Esther is she doesn't seem to know it early on. She doesn't seem to be aware of God's providence. Because, again, she's unaware that a law has been put into place for the people to be, her people, the Jews, to be annihilated. She's in the palace. Everything seems to be going well. Until Mordecai shows up at the gate in sackcloth and ashes mourning, and he sends a word to her to say, this is what's happened, and he gives her a command. I mean, he's raised her as a father, and he sends her a command. He says, here's the deal. This law has been put into place. We're all going to be killed. Go and talk to the king. Now, if you're living in providence, there's a certain way that you respond to that. If you're unaware of it, there's another way. And Esther seems to respond in a way that she's unaware, because her response is, do you understand what you're asking of me? Right? Again, if I go in there and I talk to the king and he hasn't invited me, then unless he extends his scepter to me, I'm going to be put to death. How could you ask me to go in and talk to the king? She is unaware of the providence of God in putting her in that place at that time for his purpose. But Mordecai knows. She doesn't know at that moment, but Mordecai does. At least she doesn't remember. And how easy is it for us to forget? See, sitting in this room, all of us can say we know it up here, but yet when things go down, when things get difficult, how easy it is for us to lose sight and to stop believing Romans 8:28. Mordecai knows, and he responds to her back in chapter 14, and I'm going to read this to you. He says to her, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. Providence. He says, listen, God takes care of his people. God works all things together for the good of those who love him, been called according to his will. Before Romans 8:28 is written, Mordecai is able to say, I trust the providence of God. He's going to rescue and save us because we're his people and he is faithful. But he says this, at the same time, And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom as queen for such a time as this? In other words, it's not such a question as much as a statement. He's not asking, he's kind of trying to get her to think. And what he's saying is, listen, God's going to save his people, but is it possible that the reason you are where you are, when you are, who you are, as queen of this kingdom, with access to the king, yes, it's a risk, but is it possible that the reason you're here is because that's where God has you so that you can do this? See, Mordecai knows. We know that God works all things. Esther isn't fully there yet, but Mordecai sends her that message because he's saying, I know, and you need to know, you need to see this. God is working this together for good. That's why you're here. And it's as if there's a light bulb that gets turned on in her mind. It's an aha moment for her where she finally gets it and everything changes. And what I want to look at this morning is the changes that happen in her life. We're going to look at the change. You'll see it there in your notes. I'm going to talk about the change and 3 major changes. There's kind of 2 changes in the second 2, so 5 changes. But 3 major changes that I want to look at. And then here's the challenge, is we have to examine our life. Because we can talk all day until I'm blue in the face. I could. I won't. I could talk all day until I'm blue in the face about the providence of God. The question at the end of the day is, do we know it? Do you know it? And then here's the last thing, is talk about the confidence. How do we get confidence? How do we grow to know? To walk in that more fully, not just when things are going well, but especially when things aren't. Especially when things are falling apart. But number 1, I want to talk about the change that we see in Esther. The moment she begins to know, what happens? 3 things. Number 1, the very first thing that happens, and we didn't read it this morning, but this is what we see. The first thing that happens when Esther is resting in the providence of God is she prays. It's the very first thing that happens. In fact, just let me read it to you. You don't have to turn there with me. Let me just read it to you. So Mordecai says, isn't this why you're here? Is it possible? Right? Verse 14 of chapter 4. And then listen, this is the very next thing. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Fasting is connected to prayer. She doesn't use the word pray, but that's what's happening. She says, okay, so God is in charge. God is working all this together for good. So then here's my first response. This is the first thing that we ought to do. Because of God's providence, we got to pray. Providence, knowing that God is working all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Here's where it leads. It leads to prayer. When we really rest in God's providence, it leads to prayer. Why? Well, let's first of all talk about why we don't pray. Why don't you pray? Why don't I pray? When we don't pray, why is it that we don't pray? Now, it would be easy for us to go, well, we're busy and our kids are up early or they're up late and I've got work and all this other stuff. It's easy to say all of that, but let me tell you, everybody has the same amount of time every single day, and I know it's challenging, but we can't blow it off to excuses of busyness because we invest in what we believe is vital. Right? We eat every day. There's a reason for that. Right? So why is it that we don't pray? 2 reasons that I see. And maybe there's more, but here's the 2 main ones I see. Number 1, we don't pray. We don't pray because we don't think it's needed. In other words, we approach life as if we're self-sufficient. Yes, I could pray. Yes, I could ask God. I could go to him and I could ask him for certain things, but I don't think I really need it. I think I can do this on my own. I don't need to go to him. Right? It's an attitude of self-sufficiency which borders, if not fully, falls into pride. But the second reason I think we don't pray is because we think it's ineffective. We don't think it's helpful. Yes, I could pray, but at the end of the day, if I pray, is anything really going to happen? We feel like it's a waste of time. Either it's unneeded or it's unhelpful. But here's what God's providence tells us. God's providence tells us that it's both needed and helpful. First of all, it's needed. Why? Well, because God knows everything that is needed and he has a plan. There are things that are happening in your own personal world and in the world as a whole that you don't even know that are coming. Could be good, it could be challenging, you have no idea. When Esther and Mordecai are living in Susa before she becomes queen, they have no idea what's coming. Even after she becomes queen, they have no idea. Haman's going to be promoted and he's going to come up with a plan to eradicate the Jews. They have no idea. But God does. Before they're thinking about it, before they're even praying and asking God for help, he's already giving it to them. So do we need to pray? Do we need help outside of ourselves? Absolutely. We are not, you and I, we're not all-knowing. We'd like to think that we are sometimes, but we're not all-knowing, but God is. We need prayer, but not only do we need it, it's actually helpful. Why? Because the God who knows all things is also working all things together for our good. In other words, he's the one who has the plan. The one who is in charge also has a plan, and he also has the power to accomplish that plan. And if he's the one who has who's in control, and he has the power, and he has the plan, then when we need help, where else should we go? I mean, if we really believe that God's in control, why would we go to Facebook for help? If we really believe that God has a plan that is good, I'm not saying we shouldn't go to friends for advice. God's word gives us very clear instructions that there's wisdom in counsel from other people. But why would that be the only place that we go? We don't go to God who actually has the plan. He actually knows. And not only does he have the plan and he's in charge, he has the power, he has the resources, he has everything that is needed in order to accomplish that plan. Where else should we go if we really believe in the providence of God, that his hand is in the glove of our experience, of our situations and circumstances? Where else would we go? And here's the amazing thing. God has a promise, and here's his promise. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and listen, and he will make your paths straight. God has the plan. He has the resources to accomplish that plan. He is working it out for your good. And here's what he says. If you acknowledge him, which what is that? You're going to him in prayer. In everything that's going on in your life, when you seek him out, here's what he's going to do. He's going to show you which way to go. See, when we believe in the providence of God, here's what happens. We pray, which means we ought to ask a question. If we're not praying, is it possible that's because we don't really know it yet? We're not really living in that reality yet. Number one, it leads to knowing. Number two, it leads to trust and obedience. Right? Esther goes and she prays, and God fulfills his promise. In all your ways acknowledge me, and I will make your path straight. I'll show you which way to go. And it's very clear to me that God shows her which way to go. God gives her the plan. It doesn't say she prays and doesn't talk about, well, God gave her this plan and here's how it works out. But here's how I know that God fulfilled his promise to make her path straight. Because the moment she gets done praying, she moves to action. She comes out of prayer and she's not wandering around going, well, I'm still not sure what to do. And so when she finally goes in to talk to the king and the king extends her the scepter to her, she goes, okay, he asked me what I want. What do I want? What do I want? I'm not sure. Let's have dinner. And then they have dinner and she's still not sure what to do and she's still very uncertain. So when he asks her again, she says, well, let's have dinner again because I really am not sure what I'm supposed to do. She's not acting in uncertainty. She's moving as a woman who has a plan because she's being led by God. That's what God's promise is, isn't it? And either his promises are true or they're not. If he says, in all your ways acknowledge me and I'll show you which way to go, I'll make your path straight. Either he's true to his word or he's not. And what's happened in this moment is God has shown that he's true to his word. He's shown her which way to go. And so she comes out and she goes to the king even without being invited. The king extends the scepter and she invites him and Haman to dinner. And they have dinner and then she invites them to dinner again. Why? Not because she's not sure what to do, but because God is leading her in answer to the prayer. And in that leading, here's again, what does providence give us? It leads us to prayer, but it also leads to trust and obedience because here's why. Again, God's got the plan and I can follow it. Even if it's risky, it seems to not make sense, and everything seems hopeless. I mean, think about this for a moment. God's plan was not safe. It was risky. Yes, because she had to go in and she had to go to the king before being invited, but even as we read this morning, she is about to unveil the truth of Haman's plan. And the reason that that's so risky is because the king has promoted Haman. Haman is like his chosen guy. And remember, Xerxes is a little bit of a prideful person. He's got a little bit of a pride problem. Right? So when he gets turned down by the queen in chapter 1 and kicks her out of the kingdom, there's a reason he's got a problem. And so this could very easily, when Esther says, listen, Haman, she's really saying the guy that you promoted is an evil jerk. And that could reflect poorly back on Xerxes, and Xerxes could take that not so well and get angry with her. It's a risk. God's plan is not always safe. It's a risk. And if you're going to follow it, it takes trust. You've got to be able to trust the plan so that you can obey it. Trust leads to obedience. You obey because you trust, but it's risky. And not only is it risky, sometimes God's plan doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, think about this for a moment. Mordecai tells her, go talk to the king. She goes into the king's palace. She goes in, he extends the scepter, saves her life, and he says, what do you want? I'll give you up to half of my kingdom. In my mind, that's the moment to say, Haman has planned to kill all the Jews, and I'm one of the Jews, and you need to save us. That's the moment. And instead she says, let's have dinner. Then they have dinner, and he says it again. Listen, Esther, whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. And that, again, would be the moment. Okay, now he's had something to drink. He's had something to eat. He's in a good mood. Now you can tell him. But she says, let's have dinner again. I don't know about you, but if I actually am in the know and I know what's happening at this point in time, I'm probably going to Esther and saying, what is your problem? Because you just blew it. I mean, the king asked you, what do you want? I mean, that's the moment, that's your time, and you didn't say, this is what I want. This is why I'm coming to you. You got to save the Jews. You blew your opportunity. What is going on? But why is she doing it? Because again, she's following God's plan. I mean, this is a theme throughout Scripture, by the way. There are plenty of times when God leads us with a plan that doesn't seem to make much sense, humanly speaking. Noah built an ark. Elijah poured water all over that sacrifice up on top of Mount Carmel. We're going to get that done. Jesus choosing these nobodies to be the foundation and the start of the church. How about the cross even itself? The cross is but a message of foolishness to the world. God, why would you choose that as the way to save? God has these plans that just don't seem to make sense. And so what does it take? If you believe in the providence of God, then here's what you're going to do. You're going to trust Him and you're going to obey. When it's risky, when it doesn't make sense, even when it seems hopeless. Remember, a law has been put in place that cannot be revoked even by the king himself. It seems that there is no way out. And yet if you believe in the providence of God, then you believe that there's never a point where there's no way out. You believe that there is never a point where it's completely hopeless. And the fact is, it wasn't hopeless. Following God may be risky. Sometimes it may not make sense. Sometimes it may seem hopeless. It is not easy to follow. Jesus made that very clear. Following is not easy, but at the end of the day, when we believe in providence, we believe it always leads somewhere good. It always leads somewhere good. I preached a message at a funeral just a few weeks back. They asked me to preach from Psalm 23. People love that passage. And we love it because it's so traditional. It kind of grounds us for a moment, but it's not just tradition. There's truths buried that are deep within that. There's that verse 4, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. So often we think we go into valleys because of punishment, because of sin, but that's not the case in Psalm 23. The reason that you end up in the valley in Psalm 23 is because that's where God leads you. The Lord is my shepherd. He's leading me. I'm following Him. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores. He's doing all of these good things. But sometimes He leads you into the dark valleys that are scary and frightening. But listen, the reason He leads you into those valleys is because that's the only way to the high country. That's the only way to the good that He wants to give you. It always, always, always leads somewhere good. And because of that, you can trust and obey. And that's exactly what happens. She trusts, she obeys, she follows, and what happens? Haman gets hung on his own gallows. The gallows that he constructed to kill Mordecai are the gallows that he gets hung on. And though the law can't be undone, the king enables Mordecai and Esther to write a new law, and a new law gets put in place, and the people of Israel are saved and they're rescued because now they're able to defend themselves. You realize that if the people of Israel had defended themselves against the law of the king, that even if they had survived, they would have been put to death because they defied the law. But now at this point in time, though that law can't be unwritten, the new law gets put in place, and now they can protect themselves. Providence leads to prayer. God reveals His plan. He leads us, which leads us to trust and obedience. And then here's the last one. It leads you to hope and joy. It leads you to hope and joy. I love how this chapter ends. At the end of chapter 8, then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white and a great golden crown and a robe of linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Listen, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province, in every city, wherever the king's command or his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews. Here's what I love about this. It doesn't really completely make sense because the story isn't over yet. The end of chapter 8, yes, a new law has been put in place. You can protect yourselves, but here's what hasn't happened yet. The day hasn't passed and not all the people have been saved. They're still facing attack. They're still facing destruction. You can protect yourselves, but they're still going to be attacked. Why in the world is it that they're celebrating at this point? Why is it that they have joy when they know that there's still a battle coming? Here's why. Because remember, they're in exile. Their homeland has been destroyed. They've been carried off in exile. And look, I said it at the very beginning of the service. If you weren't here, I read from Psalm chapter 10. In Psalm chapter 10, let me just read it to you. Give me just a moment. Sorry. In Psalm chapter 10, the psalmist starts, verse 1, "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" How often, when we go through difficult circumstances, is the first place, or at least a place that we end up, we begin to feel like God's abandoned us? God's not there. God isn't involved. God doesn't care. Some of you are feeling that way this morning. Even though you're here, even though you may have a smile on your face and you've put on nice clothes today, you may be here and you're in the midst of a storm in your life where you're going, God, where are you? Here's the Jews. They're in exile. Their homeland has been destroyed. They've been carried off. It's been over 100 years that they've been living in Persia. You can imagine they're feeling that God has abandoned them. And yet, and especially when the law goes out that they're going to be eradicated, you can imagine for them, that's the nail in the coffin where they're going, that's it, that's the end. God has completely left us. He's completely abandoned us. We have been forsaken. But when the law goes out that Mordecai writes, here's what that says. Yes, the battle's not over, but though God may discipline his people, he never leaves them. Though you may go through difficulty, God never abandons you. It's not because he's stopped loving you. It's not because he's walked away. It's not because he's forgotten you. It's not because he's unaware. God is. We know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. For God's people, we know that even in the darkest moment, even in the moment where we may feel the most abandoned, the truth is we've never once been forsaken or abandoned. And this is a reminder to his people. When this message goes out, it's more than a message of protect yourself. It's a message of God's still with you. And listen, trust leads to hope, and hope produces joy. When you trust in the providence of God, it produces hope, and the result of hope is always joy. Paul writes in Romans 15, verse 13, he says, may the God of hope, God is the God of hope. He says, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace. And listen, that comes from trusting in him. May the God of hope, God is the God of hope. May he fill you with joy and peace. And here's how he will fill you with joy and peace. When you trust in him, when we rest in the providence of God, we get hope. And when we get hope, the result is joy. And here's what joy is. This is my definition. Joy is, I like to write my own definitions because it forces me to ask, what do I really think that is? I'm not going to just rest in someone else's definition because usually that doesn't result in me doing much thinking. So I like to write my own definitions. Here's my definition. Joy is inside out, not outside in. Circumstance defining. It's not defined by my circumstances. Inner rest and contentment. That comes from trusting in God for his plan, purpose, provision, and promise. It is inside out, circumstance defining, inner rest and contentment that comes from joy, comes from trusting in God's plan, purpose, provision, and promise. Joy isn't about circumstances being settled. It isn't about getting rid of uncertainty. Joy comes from faith in the providence of God in the midst of uncertainty. See, when you go from hoping that God is working to knowing, to confidence, your circumstances don't get changed, but you do. There's, I'm sure, a lot more that we could say, but these are the things that I see in Esther that get changed because she goes from where she is to knowing that God has been working and is working all things together for her good. And the question now, that's the change that's produced in her, the challenge for us is to say, is that true of us? Do we know? Do you know? Not is it some statement out here, some truth that you can assent to say, yeah, the Bible says that. Do you know it? Do you rest in it? Do you believe it? And here's where the test comes down. Again, it's not when things are going well. It's not when we're sitting in the sanctuary. It's not when things are easy, when things are happy, when everything's going well, but when things are hard, when things are pressing in on you, when things are uncertain, when you're losing hope, in that moment, do you know or do you not know? That's where the test is. And if we're all really transparent in this room, and if we're all really honest, every single one of us would probably have to say sometimes. Sometimes. Listen, I can get up here and I can tell you all of this. I can say all of this. God works all things together for the good of those who love Him, been called according to His purpose and according to His plan. But my wife would be able to tell you that there's times when I don't remember that. When I lose sight of that. There's times when you lose sight of it. There's times when you forget, when we get overwhelmed in the midst of our circumstances, and we need to be reminded, which is what this whole book is about. It's grounding us back in this reality that when everything seems uncertain, when all of this is hard, you need to remember God is still involved, often unseen, often even when you don't know it, and He's working all things together for good. And one day it's all going to make sense. One day it's all going to fit together. The challenge is not to wait to trust Him until it all makes sense, but to trust Him now. Because He wants you to be free, not when you get to the other side of what you're going through. He wants you to be free in the midst of it. And so how do we get there? How do we get that confidence? I want to read something to you that I actually wrote earlier on in the week. Sometimes I have to go back and reread what I wrote to remember the truth that I knew at that moment. Been writing these devotionals, or at least trying to stay on top of writing these devotionals as we read through the Bible in this year. And let me read to you what I wrote. God is not distant and uncaring, but is personally involved. So much so that He sent His Son into this world at the right time so that He might literally take sin and its consequences into His hands. Jesus came and faced life as one of us. He knows and understands what it is to suffer, to go through rejection, hatred, broken relationships, temptation, and loss. Everything that we've been through and faced, so He has. He knows what it is to go through injustice. He faced the greatest injustice of all, the cross, and was mocked as people laughed and said, He saved others, He cannot save Himself. He's the King of Israel. Let Him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in Him. Jesus could have come down from the cross, but then their believing would have been useless. Jesus stayed on the cross by choice and was abandoned in our place. His cry was, my God, why have you forsaken me? Rather than a feeling, this was a reality. On the cross, Jesus bore the fullness of our sin and the penalty that sin deserved. On the cross, He faced the full reality of hell in our place so that we would never have to. Jesus endured the greatest suffering so our suffering might no longer destroy us but be used to transform us in this life. Jesus faced death and overcame it so that the casket might no longer be a prison but a chrysalis in which we are transformed for eternity. On that cross, Jesus hung Satan on His own gallows, death. And now the undoing power of suffering and death have been changed into a tool for God's reshaping and remaking of our lives, both now and forever. I want to read that to you again. On that cross, Jesus hung Satan on His own gallows, death. And now the undoing power of suffering and death, because it once, apart from grace, suffering and death undo us. But because of grace, He undid that power so that those things are changed from undoing us to a tool for God reshaping and remaking our lives both now and forever. And though the old law could not be undone, the penalty that we deserved, God has written a new law through Christ, the law of grace. The law that sets us free from the power of the enemy and has given us present and eternal hope. And though the story is still being written, though we still face the battles against our enemy, we know the end of the story. We know that our God is with us, and that by his law of grace, he's given us everything we need to take our stand and defend ourselves against the enemy. Though the enemy rages, though the enemy seeks our destruction, his greatest weapons have become nothing. For we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his will. Whenever I do a funeral, I start it with Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It says, there is a time and a season for everything under the sun. There is a time and a season for everything. And verse 4 says that there is a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And most of the time we think of those things as exclusive and separate, that when it's time for weeping, there's no time for laughter. When it's a time for mourning, there's no time for celebration. And yet the amazing reality of the Christian life in this world is that those two things are brought together. It's not as if mourning is eradicated. We live in a life that's hard. Providence doesn't change that. This message doesn't change that life is hard. But here's what it does. It fills it all with hope. It fills it all with hope. So that we can dance in the midst of our mourning. So we can laugh in the midst of the storm. So we can celebrate in the midst of uncertainty, for we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his will and his purpose. And so here's the question today. Do you know?